There, let me remind you of the coming events this week and next week. On Friday, there is no lunchtime talk at noon, but there is the second lecture of the annual lecture series at the center, which will take place on Friday, March 26th at 3:30 Eastern Time. And the lecture will be given by Ellen Landry from UC Davis. And Ellen Landry will be talking about pacifism, mathematics, method without metaphysics. And you're all invited to join us for this lecture. On Tuesday next week, we have our next lunchtime talk given by Danielle Venner from Carnegie Mellon University, the Department of Philosophy. And she will be talking about clinical research as basic structure and the ethics of health research priority setting. And on Friday next week, Chris Weber, who is a Center Fellow this semester, will be talking about Hamiltonian mechanics and causation. So we're looking forward to all this lecture. If you're interested by the lecture of the annual lecture series on Friday or by any of the 2 lunchtime talks next week, please go to the website, look for the calendar, and there you can register for the Zoom talks and you'll get an invitation to join us. I hope you will be interested. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Riet von Bork, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Science this year. Riet got her PhD in 2018 from the University of Amsterdam, the Department of Psychological Method. She has been working, she was an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam before joining us here at the center. She's been working on the interpretation of psychological models, mostly in part pushing for causal interpretation of these models, as we will hear today. She has published widely in a range of journals in psychology and the sciences, as well as journals as an intersection of philosophy and psychology, such as theory and psychology. And it's my really great pleasure to listen to Riet today. So Riet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eduard, for these kind words. So I will today indeed push for a causal interpretation of models in psychology, and specifically measurement models used there. And to start, I think I'm going a little bit against the grain, because I think everyone is taught in their first statistics class that correlation is not causation, and the measurement models that we use in psychology, we typically estimate them from correlations. So yeah, that seems to be incompatible, but I'm still going to try to make a case for a causal interpretation. So first, I will start with just introducing what psychometric models are, and then explain what I mean by a causal interpretation of these models. So psychometric models are measurement models in psychology. Then I will explain that with causal interpretation, I don't mean causal inference. It's 2 distinct things. And then I will go on to explain why it really matters to give this causal interpretation, and talk about an implication of that, namely that if we're going to interpret these models causally, and that means in light of the explanations they give for correlations in the data, then we should actually go on and really compare different competing explanations. And ending there, in this comparison of different explanations, I end with something that's more sort of work in progress and what I'm going to do in the next months. And that's the role of simplicity in this context. And the types of psychometric models that I talk about will be network models and latent variable models. And so I'm going to argue for a causal interpretation of network models and latent variable models, and then from there on try to think about how we then should go on and compare these models as different explanations for the data. So this is what I'm talking about today is partly work that I've done in my dissertation. And in the Netherlands, we print our dissertations, we actually design covers and stuff, and then we have several copies that we hand out to colleagues. And I would, of course, have liked it a lot to bring some of these copies and give them to whoever would be interested, but well, in this time I can't. But I promise that if I come back some other time to the center, then I'll bring copies for whoever would want one. So in this dissertation, I also have argued for, how should we interpret different psychometric models in the context of two different types of psychometric models that I will explain now. So what are we doing in psychometrics? I sometimes like to Google a term just to sort of see how that term is being used, and the images that pop up can sometimes be sort of helpful to see how people think about these terms. Sometimes it's not really helpful, but in this case, I actually noted that there were sort of three types of images that pop up that can help the story that I'm telling. So the first type of images that pop up are these heads with mechanisms in there. So I guess this is something about how in psychology we want to understand how the mind works, and psychometrics can help us understand that. Images of people filling out questionnaires, and images of statistical models, or one lonely person looking at statistics on a board. So first I will connect the first two types of images. And the way I'm going to do that is that, so in psychology, typically, we want to understand how the mind works, and we use concepts, properties of this mind that we cannot observe. So we cannot open up the mind and just see how it works. Rather, these properties are unobserved. Instead, what we do is we give questionnaires to people, and in that way try to use this as an indication, the response that we get as an indication of certain properties of the mind. So to give an example, personality traits, something like extraversion is not something we directly observe, but we can ask someone and whether that person is talkative, whether that person likes to go to parties, whether that person has many friends, and we see that as a sort of indication of this concept, extraversion. And psychometric theory basically connects these things that we want to measure, something like extraversion, but could also be, for example, mental disorders or cognitive abilities. These are all things that we don't observe, and connects that to observables. So, for example, in this case, behaviors that indicate a certain personality trait, maybe performance on cognitive tasks to learn about a certain ability, or symptoms of a disorder that indicates a disorder. And different psychometric theories can both offer different connections between this unobserved thing and the observed and the observables. So between extraversion and these behaviors like being talkative, as well as giving alternative explanations for correlations between these observable behaviors. So what we typically see is that people who are talkative also tend to go to parties and have many friends. And so these behaviors are sort of, they're correlated. And you can explain that differently with different psychometric theories. And the same is for symptoms that are correlated, or performance on different kind of tasks that are correlated. And the first sort of traditional way of doing this is latent variable theory. And in latent variable theory, the thing that we want to measure becomes a latent variable. So here extraversion is a latent variable. And that causes the different behaviors that then, because they are effects of this latent variable reflect the latent variable. So someone is being talkative because that person is extroverted. And that also immediately explains why these behaviors are correlated, because they all rely on the same common cause. So someone who is being talkative, we know that indicates that this person is extroverted, and we know that extroverted people also tend to go to parties. So in that way, the fact that they all reflect extroversion explains why these behaviors correlate. Same for example, symptoms of a disorder. Some symptoms tend to go together. So people that have sleeping problems and sadness and concentration problems. And in latent variable theory, the disorder, depression, for example, is a latent variable, and that causes these symptoms. And as such, these symptoms are manifestations of this latent variable. And as such, also explains the correlations between these symptoms. So someone with sleeping problems, that indicates that this person suffers depression, and people that are depressed also tend to have concentration problems and sadness. But recently, an alternative framework started to exist in psychometrics, network theory. And this gives an alternative explanations for why we see correlations between certain behaviors or symptoms or performances on cognitive tasks, as well as also gives a different connection between these observables and whatever we try to measure. So in network theory, behaviors correlate because they directly influence each other. So they sort of reinforce each other. For example, in the case of extroversion, someone is talkative, therefore more easily makes friends. When you make more friends, you get more easily invited to parties. There you make even more friends. Maybe that boosts your self-confidence, so you find it easier to start talking to someone. And so these things connect to each other in a network. And now extroversion is no longer a latent variable that causes these behaviors, but it's basically just the name that we give to this cluster of behaviors. Similarly, symptoms could cause each other, like because I haven't slept well, I might the next day suffer from concentration problems, and then I don't get to the work I want to do. I feel guilty, therefore I feel bad about myself. And so certain symptoms start sort of reinforcing each other until you get in a sort of state where we call it depressed. And now we get to the third part of the images, which were these statistical models. And so the different psychometric theories that I've now explained, so latent variable theory and network theory, can be expressed in statistical models. So in the latent variable framework, this is a latent variable model, and that's the model here on the left, where so the squares are observed variables and circles represent latent variables. And so this statistical model estimates a latent variable from the observed variables by taking its shared variance. So whatever is shared among the observed variables will be captured by a statistical dimension that's the latent variable. And that's how it's estimated. And that fits really well with the latent variable theory, because if there were some latent variable that causes observed behaviors, then that's reflected in whatever is shared. And for example, an important assumption that's sort of the core of this model is local independence, which means that if you condition on this latent variable, then the observed variables become independent. That's also something that naturally follows from a common cause perspective. So if that extroversion were the common cause of these behaviors, then you would expect that if you only look at people with this, that are equally extroverted, for example, then these behaviors no longer correlate. On the right, you have the network model, and there typically we estimate conditional independencies. So associations between these observed variables while conditioning on all the other variables in the network. And so we have different models that are used in these different frameworks, and these are statistical models. And as I already said, what we learn in statistics as an important rule is that correlation is not causation. And this had quite an impact on psychometrics, I think. In psychometrics, causal talk was really sort of taken out of the psychometric field completely. And these models are estimated only from correlations. And so what it pushed for is that in psychometrics, these models are typically seen or understood purely as statistical models without any causal interpretation. And then what these models mean is something like, for example, in the latent variable model, this latent variable is the shared variance. So that's something you often hear. Well, no, that's not the common cause, that's just the shared variance. Are these connections in the network relations that represent reinforcement? No, it's just conditional independency. So it's only interpreted in a statistical sense. But I'm going to argue that it's helpful to actually interpret them causally. So I argue that the latent variable model, for example, but also the network model, can be interpreted in light of the theory it originates from. So these models really originate from causal theories. And what that means is, for example, in this latent variable case, that the latent variable is a common cause. So, for example, in this paper with Lisa Wijse and Maaike Remtula, we have argued that you can see the latent variable in a latent variable model as a common cause. And I'm now, for example, also still finishing up a project in which I argue that also the errors, so in the model on the right, the red arrows represent errors, that these can also be interpreted as unique causes of the item responses, sort of things that also, in addition to this thing that you try to measure, influence the item response and sort of disturbs the measurement. And I think the most important reason for arguing for this causal interpretation is that a statistical model is a set of statistical assumptions, but these statistical assumptions are motivated from a causal story, and they get their meaning from a causal story. So, for example, I already gave the example of local independence. Local independence is the most important assumption for the latent variable model, and it directly follows from the idea that there's a common cause. If there's not a common cause, it's just not really sure anymore why we should want to test an assumption like local independence. And there are also models that don't make this assumption. So I really use the causal interpretation to sort of give meaning to these statistical assumptions and sort of motivate them. And in that way, it also becomes possible to reason about decisions that you make in modeling in terms of this theory. So it can inform the, for example, additional assumptions you want to make or decisions that you make in modeling. So for the rest of the talk, it's then quite important to really distinguish the statistical model and the causal model. So now I'm going to use statistical model to refer only to this statistical model without a causal interpretation. So I've here included the formulas not to explain them, but more as a sort of like that you recognize yeah, that is just the statistical part of the model. And the causal model is this model in which you also include causal assumptions. So now the latent variable is actually a common cause. And for me, it also helps to think, to distinguish the causal and the non-causal interpretation as sort of to think about when these models are false. So the statistical model, here the formula and these set of statistical assumptions basically, that model is correct if these assumptions hold in the data. So these are assumptions about the probability distributions that are in the data. And if these assumptions about the probability distributions are correct, then that model is correct. But the causal model requires more, because now it's not just that these assumptions about probability distribution should be correct, but also the causal mechanism it represents. So it could be that you have a different model that implies the same probability distributions. And if that's not a common cause model, then in the causal interpretation, this model would be incorrect. And so that also brings me to the important point that causal interpretation is not causal inference, because the common cause model implies that certain statistical assumptions are met. So for example, local independence follows from a common cause model. And so you can express that common cause model in a set of statistical assumptions, but testing the statistical assumptions is not enough to test the actual causal model. And the reason is that there can be different causal models that imply probability distributions for which the same statistical assumptions hold. So for example, this network model here, in which all of the connections between the observed variables are the same, actually implies a probability multivariate probability distribution for which the one factor model also fits perfectly. So the statistical assumptions are met, but in this causal framework, the common cause model is still not true. So it's not causal inference because we're not learning from the data which causal model is true. So we're not using the empirical data to infer causality. Rather, I argue that we should interpret these models causally because it can help us reason about why we make certain assumptions and why we would expect certain assumptions to hold and to give meaning. But of course, you might ask, well, if the correlations are not going to help us identify these causal relations, and so fitting a latent variable model, good fit doesn't tell us that the common causes model is correct. So why should we actually go on and do this causal interpretation? And I think it's really important to acknowledge the sort of theories that are implied by these models, because using different statistical models really shapes how we think about the things that we measure. So I'm going to argue that using a network model or a latent variable models really shapes how we think about the constructs that we model, even though people might argue, no, it's just two different statistical representations. There are only ways of describing the probability distribution. So in a way, it's just two different ways of summarizing the data. I'm going to argue it's more. It's going to push us to think about things in a certain way. And I'm going to do that with the example of comorbidity. So comorbidity is that certain disorders tend to co-occur. So for example, major depression and anxiety disorder often co-occur. And so these disorders are comorbid. And it turns out that many disorders actually show comorbidity. So basically they correlate. And so if you're going to model that with the network model, this is something you could get. So here, all of the nodes in the network represent symptoms. And they are now colored by the different colors indicate different disorders that they are part of. So if you're gonna use a network model to model comorbidity, then what this pushes you to do is to look, if you're gonna explain comorbidity, look for symptoms that play an important role in comorbidity. So for example, here, the white nodes are major depression and the blue nodes are anxiety disorder. And node number 8 plays a pretty sort of important, seems to play an important role here, being strongly connected, for example, to node number 5. And node number 8 here, I think, refers to sleeping problems. And so using a network model pushes you in the direction to think about which symptoms explain that certain disorders are comorbid. So certain symptoms might play an important role in both reinforcing certain symptoms that belong to depression and symptoms that belong to anxiety. You can also model it as a latent variable model. So here, each of the smaller circles are disorders. So these are already latent variables that are measured through symptoms. But there's an even more general latent variable, which is called the p-factor. And this p-factor is connected to all of these disorders. And it's described in this paper of Caspi as, at the level of the individual, this factor reflects meaningful differences between persons on a single dimension that represents the tendency to experience psychiatric problems as persistent and comorbid. So here they have chosen to model the correlations between disorders with a model that estimates a latent variable from this shared variance between disorders. And now they interpret this as the tendency to experience psychiatric problems as persistent and comorbid. So someone with a high level of P has a high tendency to experience all sorts of disorders, and therefore they correlate. And someone with a low level of P doesn't have this tendency. And if you're going to ask, what is this P? What is this P factor? Is this, then you sometimes hear from psychometricians, it's just a shared variance. We don't have to commit to an actual existing P, it's just whatever is shared between the disorders. But still, this model pushes you to think in a certain way, namely that we have some tendency. Where would that tendency be? Probably somewhere in the brain or in the genes. And that's exactly what happens. So people are going to look for it, investigating the genetic architecture of general psychopathology, the P factor and its genomic and neural equivalents. Polygenic score is associated with general psychopathology, the P factor, genetic analysis, a polygenic P factor for major psychiatric disorders. And this, for example, is Thomas Insel, who was the director of the National Institute for Mental Health. And in this piece that's published in Science, he argues for reconsidering mental disorders as brain disorders. And what's also quite interesting here is that it says mental health division will no longer fund research aiming to relieve symptoms without probing underlying causes. So focus on the biological underpinnings rather than the symptoms. Whereas as we saw with the network model, it pushes you really to look at the symptoms, to maybe relieve certain symptoms like sleeping problems, so that other symptoms don't get reinforced by that symptom. So I'm not going to pick sides here because I'm not really an expert on psychopathology, but I mostly want to make the point here that even if these models are just representations of the data, they are not neutral representations. It matters a lot which model you pick, and they push you to think about these things in a certain way. And therefore, I think we should acknowledge the sort of theories that are, that are represented by these kind of models. So I have now argued that it matters which explanation is correct. So now the network model and the latent variable model have given different explanations. So if you interpret them causally, they give different explanations for a phenomenon like comorbidity or correlations in your data. And it's important which one is correct, because maybe the one says that you have to focus on treating symptoms, whereas the other says that we have to put a lot of money in finding out where depression exists in our in our brain, for example. But I've also argued that model fit, unfortunately, doesn't tell us which explanation is correct, because different competing explanations might both be consistent with the correlations that we observe in the data. And this is actually also the case for the p-factor. So, for example, I've argued with colleagues that although the p-factor was chosen compared to other latent variable models based on fit, that fit actually doesn't say much about whether an actual p-factor would exist, because there are alternative explanations that don't use a p-factor and also are consistent with the correlations in data. So, for example, a network model. And also, for example, Wes Bonifay in this article shows very nicely, I think, how model fit of the bifactor model, so that's the type of model that the p-factor model is, doesn't say much about the model being correct at all, because that model turns out to be super flexible. So if you make all sorts of arbitrary data sets, then it turns out that compared to other models, this bifactor model fits to any kind of data. So basically, we're sort of with a problem, because on the one hand, it's important to know which explanation is correct, and at the same time, model fit just doesn't really tell us that. So what to do? I think the most important thing here would be that we at least consider alternative explanations. So rather than just let using a latent variable or a network model be a sort of arbitrary decision, because it's just one way of summarizing the data, and then just use that, see them as competing explanations and try to look for different explanations of the correlation in the data and compare them. But that's not trivial, and that's what we'll get to. But to give a sort of recap of where we are now and where I'm going with the last minutes of this talk. So I have now argued that measurement models should be understood in light of the explanations they offer for the data. And in that case, network models and latent variable models suddenly are no longer just two different ways of representing the data, just two different ways of summarizing the data. They now suddenly represent competing explanations, of which it's important to pit them against each other and find evidence for one explanation over the other, for example. And so it becomes important to distinguish them and compare them. And I have already have some work on trying to do that. One thing that I have done, for example, is trying to look for things on which these models start to diverge. So if models are really equivalent, then it becomes really hard to disentangle them. But often these models are sort of close together statistically, but not entirely equivalent. And then you can look for specific things on which they diverge. So for example, many latent variable models imply that, that partial correlations cannot be stronger than simple correlations. That's just something that follows from these models, and that doesn't have to be the case for network models. And so you can sort of use that as a specific thing to look for in the data, for example. But still, we're also left with this thing of what about this flexibility of certain models? We should also consider the difference in simplicity of network models and latent variables. So that's what brings me to the what's next. And that's if we're going to compare these models as different explanations, how to account for model simplicity in this case, because for statistical model comparisons, that's really important. If one model is much more flexible and can explain much more different types of data, then you want to account for that. And how should we do that in this causal interpretation? So I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes just to sort of set out what things are that I'm thinking about for this project about simplicity that I want to do in the next couple of months. And so it's also an open invitation for whoever thinks there's something interesting about that to contact me. So the reason I think it's interesting to look at simplicity is that basically because I've argued that we should not consider these statistical models purely as statistical models, that we should also think differently about simplicity, because the typical ways of measuring simplicity in statistical models only account for the statistical models. So in model comparisons, one way of accounting for model simplicity is just looking at the number of free parameters of the model. So this is, for example, the degrees of freedom is a function of the free parameters. And most measures like AIC and BIC use this as a measure of simplicity. But for this measure of simplicity, models that are statistically equivalent will be equally simple. And another example is fitting propensity. So that was also this thing that Wes Bonifay looked at with this sort of nice plot of how much of certain arbitrary data can a certain model be fit to. So a model's fitting propensity is basically the average ability of a model to fit data, and the higher this, the better this model can fit to any sort of data, the less good fit tells you about that model that it's correct. So you can make all sorts of random correlation matrices and have two different models fit to all of them. And if one fits to many more different correlation matrices, then it's just much more flexible. But also fitting propensity is something that only accounts for the statistical models. So if a certain network model and latent variable model are equivalent, then, and there are network models and latent variable models that are equivalent, then the fitting propensity, just like the number of free parameters, will be the same for the two models. So what I actually would want is to see if there are measures of complexity that do not only look at the statistics, or not only account for the statistical models, but also take some of these causal assumptions into account. And one idea could be, sorry, I already said this, to look at entities that are postulated by the model. So if the latent variable model here gets a causal interpretation, then the latent variable is not just a shared variance, it's an actual new causal entity that causes the observed variable. So you basically posit an additional thing, for example, extraversion or depression. This is not the case if it's just a statistical model, then it's just the shared variance. But in this causal interpretation, that's something that's, for example, additionally postulated by the latent variable model, which is not postulated by this network model. So that's just one line of thinking I could take. Another one is the number of assumptions of a model. So here, for example, is quite interesting. Gignac has argued that there are here two different types of latent variable models. So on the left is called a higher order vector model, and the other one is a hierarchical vector model or a bifactor model. And Gignac basically argues here the direct hierarchical model may be considered simpler than the higher order model because it does not require a theoretical justification for full mediation. And so he argues that the model on the left makes an additional assumption, namely that all of the relations between G and the observed, so the squares in the model, are fully mediated by this PIQ and VIQ. And so if you're going to posit something like that, then you should have a theoretical justification. And if you don't, then it's just simpler to not make this assumption. Note that actually the other model is the one that, the model on the right, is the one that has more free parameters, a much bigger fitting propensity. So on the statistical side, that would be the one that's more complex. I don't think this reasoning of Gignac makes much sense to me. So I consider something like full mediation as a constraint on the model, and putting more constraints results in riskier predictions. And I therefore would argue that putting more assumptions on the model actually makes the model simpler. So I would, just like the statistical measures, I would also argue that the model on the left here is the simpler one. So I would maybe argue the other way around. The more assumptions, the simpler the model, because these assumptions make that the model makes risky predictions, but also, and that's a more statistical point, but also that these models are more falsifiable. And this doesn't necessarily has to be a purely statistical point, because so that's in line with Popper, who argued that simpler models are more falsifiable. This is not necessarily statistical, because you can have two different types of assumptions that you can add to a model. You can indeed add statistical assumptions like constraints. So for example, this full mediation. Although mediation, you could also interpret it causally, but my point is basically you can add statistical assumptions, but you can also add causal assumptions. And so one way of thinking about simplicity is looking at the causal assumptions that a model make and how you can falsify it by falsifying either of these assumptions. So for example, here the network model and the latent variable model make different predictions about what happens when you start intervening. So these models are not equivalent, but even if you would take an equivalent network model and a statistically equivalent network model and latent variable model, then if you start intervening on the model, on variables in the model, then of course as causal models they would make different predictions, even though they are statistically equivalent. So intervention could maybe help out here to distinguish, to have models that are statistically close to each other diverge from each other. So here, for example, in this latent variable model, if you intervene on x1, so now I'm gonna interpret them causally, then you would expect that nothing happens to x2 to x4. And Pearl would consider that, for example, a very strong causal assumption, because it is exactly zero, the causal effects from x1 to the other x's. Note that intervention on the latent variable is difficult or impossible because it's a latent variable. But the observed variables, if we're going to intervene on them, these models make different predictions. For example, in the network model, if I intervene on x1, you do expect that the other variables could change as a result of that. But how exactly then depends on the strength of these ROs. And since that's something you can estimate, sort of free parameter, in a way that's a weaker assumption. So this really isn't completely, this is not, I haven't completely thought these things out, but these are the lines along which I'm reasoning right now to sort of try to think of what a causal interpretation of psychometric models gives as new questions for terms that we used specifically in the statistic context and now might also get maybe a new meaning if we consider them in a causal context, such as simplicity. All right. Yeah, so to sort of sum up these first thoughts would be that there are certain measures that consider the statistical models only, like the free parameters, the fitting propensity, and statistical assumptions. But maybe there are also things that not only consider the statistical models, but in addition also account for causal assumptions in a model. That brings me to the end. I don't have a conclusion on the simplicity part yet, but the general conclusion would be surely correlation is not causation. But if we're going to explain correlations in the data or explain comorbidity or explain in general, then it helps to interpret these models causally. And that's it. Thank you. So that leaves some time for questions.
All right, thank you, Riet, for this exciting talk. We have plenty of time for questions. Let me remind you how we're going to work. If you have a question, please go to the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A button and write your name there, and I will promote you to the status of panelist, and you can ask your question directly to Riet. Riet, could you get out of the shared screen mode so that we can all share the screen? And Paul Scott, you're first.
Hi, so I appreciate the talk quite a lot. I have a few questions, but I'll just ask one to start. So one thing I was wondering, and I've wondered this about network models, and I don't know that I've gotten to the point of, I appreciate their relationality of them. I like that about them. But the one thing I've always wondered when looking at them is about the score decomposition itself. I always think to myself, well, what happened to the score decomposition to set out the different sources of variance? Where is the measurement error in a network model? So I guess that's my primary question.
Yeah, so that's a good question and an important question. Yeah, so measurement error is, yeah, it depends a bit on what you mean by measurement error, but the parts that are unique to an item and not shared with the other items, like in a latent variable model, are now suddenly considered, could be also interesting predictors of other variables in a network. So in a way, it sort of makes sense that part of what is considered unique, what is unique to an item, can still play a role in predicting other items in the network.
Well, I guess I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I was want to say, if you take measurement really as these things that are uncorrelated to anything, and it is a problem that the nodes in the network still have this in them. So indeed, it's not like, the nice thing about a latent variable model is that it can take out the measurement error because it takes out everything that's unique, and the part of that's unique includes the measurement error. But maybe whatever is unique is not just measurement error, but the measurement error is still in there in the network model, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was more to the idea of like the circumstance under which the item responses are collected. So item responses or whatever it is that you're measuring, you know, before anything happens, it's all measurement error, right? So it gives us the base from which we get to pull out sources. So say, you know, a certain item's wording threw people off. And so there's some consistency in that. And it might be shared possibly with even other items. And so you can pull that out through the score decomposition, you know, like a G theory type thing. But maybe at some point you end up with a random noise. With the network models, it just feels like all of those errors just get kind of pulled along. So no matter what your causal assumptions are, the error in that, whatever you posit is the beginning of that network, just kind of carries along. And that's always been sort of a sense that I've had and have been, it's a curiosity that's made me a slow adapter to network models, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Right.
Yeah.
Read, go for it.
No, I'm just going to say I agree, and it's an interesting point.
Good. Paul, do you want to stay around in case there is time for further question? Yeah, okay, good. Thanks. Aidan, please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for such an interesting talk, Riet. It was really a pleasure to listen to you. It was a very clear description of both latent variables and network models. And I'm sure a lot of people took away a very good understanding based on your talk. So thank you so much for that. One question I had in going through it, and I forget exactly how you said this early on, but you said something to the effect of, well, we're going to hold the exact features of the data aside for right now and just focus on how these models perform somewhat in the abstract. And I think that your notion of simplicity is really interesting, and some of the aspects of the way you're thinking about it would contrast with my intuition in terms of thinking about, you know, networks as potentially more complex than latent variable models. But it sounds like based on the way you're thinking about it, there might be an argument made to go the other way around, but you're still playing with these ideas. So I understand. But one way I thought, and to try and frame this in your framing of simplicity, so as not to try to take this a place you don't want to take it. One question I thought about is the assumptions necessary to be made about the data that you're actually using. So in actuality, we can't divorce the models from the data. And I tend to be both a personality and a clinical psychologist, so I'm very interested in the actual data as it manifests. And so one of the things, like for instance, Caspi's model that you presented, which I think has a lot of problems, one thing that is interesting about it is they talk about it as a propensity to experience a mental health problem over the lifespan, and they concatenate lifespan diagnoses. So it really is the individual differences in the tendency to experience lifespan disorders. The other model, which you presented, which you were a co-author on, which was I think the small world structure of psychopathology or something like that, but the large network of all the symptoms. One of the things about that is that there you have, the symptoms are measured on very different timescales. So for instance, generalized anxiety disorder requires a period of 6 months. Major depression is some 2-week period in the past year or something. Other ones require a month period, so the notion of these things being sort of causally influential vis-a-vis, sort of direct relations starts to get a little bit more tenuous. Whereas the latent variable, by making fewer assumptions about where what is going on in the shared variance, like what are the shared underlying processes, well, maybe it's more complex, maybe it's more simple. I don't know. I guess I wondered if you had thoughts about how one links back to the theories that underlie the actual models in addition to, and how that interfaces with the data one collects.
Thank you. That's not an easy question, but very interesting. Yeah, so there are a couple of things. So one is more at the complexity, simplicity part, and one is maybe more at sort of problems of for example, a network model of these disorders. I'm not a co-author on that paper, so I actually so I'm just gonna talk about it, but I'm not a complete expert in that specific
I'm bad. My bad.
research, but no, that's fine. I guess what I hope is that actually a causal interpretation makes indeed these things tenuous, because then we're gonna at least try to improve it. So I know that the causal interpretation comes with a lot of problems, but what I really hope is that it then makes these problems urgent, and so that we're going to really think about these things. Whereas sometimes I'm afraid that if we don't interpret it causally, we just don't see them as problems, but then still there is some causal interpretation because people just go on wanting to explain it connected to indeed real world phenomena. And so I completely agree that it's really interesting, something like these different time scales, and becomes even more urgent with a causal interpretation. But I don't think that's a problem for the causal interpretation.
Yeah.
But with your respect to the complexity of these models, so can you say one more time how, so do you mean that the network model makes more assumptions in that sense because it, for example, has to basically assume that it should be on the same sort of time scale while maybe it isn't, something like that?
Yeah, I think that would be my perspective here. One thing I want to make sure I say before I forget is I totally agree with you that by forcing people to pay attention to the causality, I think it's going to force people to do a much better job with both latent variables and network models. So I think holding people's feet to the fire is a very important job that you're doing, and I really applaud that. That's great. Yeah, I was thinking along the lines of, because the network model in these spaces, I think you need to make an assumption based on network theory, at least as I understand it, would be that these are tend to be, sort of within person associations. One thing I don't see in the network literature is sort of how these might propagate up to between person associations and how you might be able to do that. But anyway.
Yeah, no, these are very important questions. I don't really have an immediate answer to it because, I think the problem is also that I guess I see these as problems because I take the causal interpretation, and then so I would indeed say, okay, we have to make sense of these causal connections, and either they are processes that take place within a person, but then in that case, it also needs to be true that these processes take place within a person, and we can no longer hide between but there's between things. But maybe I'm not saying. I mean, there are also interesting causal. I think can be interesting causal relations at the between level, but the thing is just that this causal interpretation immediately makes it important that you are at the right level and you are at the and that's, I guess, something that's just difficult. And I just don't I don't have a complete other than let's try to improve our methods and make sure that it better and better matches the kind of theory that we try to capture with these models.
Well, thank you very much. That and I think that what you're doing here is really interesting work.
Thank you. Michael, go for it.
Yes. Hi, again, thank you very much for a very stimulating and very clear presentation there. I'm not a statistician, but in thinking about this, is it possible that these two approaches are not completely mutually exclusive? That is, in the typical presentation, latent variable, obviously all the arrows point out, right? And what if some were two-sided? For example, and it seems to me that manipulation is obviously an important thing to think about in terms of causal attributions. So thinking about cognitive behavioral therapies for depression, where the idea is obviously you try and change the thought that is somehow viewed causally in causing the entire constellation of other symptoms. Again, there are certainly a lot of studies that look at this carefully that, again, changing this, self-defeating thoughts or whatever will improve sleep, will reduce suicidal ideation, et cetera, improve concentration. So it so it seems like that's something more than just a network, and perhaps with some sort of latent cause uniting lots of this, but a way to affect the latent cause, right? So I don't know. Thoughts on that stuff?
Yeah, no, that is correct. And there are also models that combine them. You can have a model with both latent and connections between observed variables, or even use all of the unique parts of the variable. So if you take one latent variable and you have the unique parts, then still make a network between the unique parts. There are many ways in which you can combine them, and actually also it might be interesting to introduce some latent variables in a network to get rid of the measurement error. So that was the problem that Paul also already mentioned, that yeah, maybe for some of the nodes, it makes sense, if you think there's a lot of measurement error, to use multiple indications of that thingy that you want in a network, and in that sense sort of take out that measurement error part. So yes, you can combine them. And I guess, yeah, then I would just still say, interpret that as a new causal theory. And yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. JP, go for it.
Yeah, so I was actually thinking along very similar lines to Michael there. So I actually also wanted to push back on, like, are these models really in competition? So I understood that you framed everything in terms of explanation. This is how I'll try and say something different from what he did. And so you sort of motivated things by saying, look, it matters which explanation is correct. You know, we have these alternative explanations and we should compare them. But we could just deny that the network models are really explanations. They're just showing us interesting correlations in the observable symptoms, and that's just serving a very different role from a latent variable model, where we want to see the actual cause, which might be something like, okay, there's this neural common cause of symptoms in depression and anxiety, and at the same time we can do these interesting network models of the symptoms in depression and anxiety. So I just also didn't see them as, you know, necessarily in competition. But I guess what I would emphasize here is that to resist the causal interpretation, we could think of the network models as just having a very different role to play. It's not about causal explanation at all. It's doing something else for us, which is also good.
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, I guess it's not just for the network models. The same you could do for the latent variable model. You could also say the other way around. Okay, the network model is an explanation and the latent variable model is just an interesting way of summarizing shared variance, for example. And I guess one disclaimer I should make is, if your goal is only prediction, or there are cases in which I agree that maybe what we're not after is trying to compare different explanations for the data. But still, also, if you, for example, say, okay, these networks are just an interesting way of visualizing correlations, then as soon as we're sort of fitting a model and in that sense put certain assumptions in a model or make certain decisions. So for the network model, for example, we condition on other variables in a network, then they become sort of arbitrary as soon as you leave out the causal interpretation. And maybe that's fine because you just choose to visualize them in that way. But yeah, you can make a network of correlations, you can make a network of partial correlations. But the motivation for fitting, for example, networks as they are now typically done and by conditioning on other variables, I think often comes from this idea that we want to get rid of spurious relations, which then indeed immediately implies some sort of causal talk back into there. But I also want to say that I agree that it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to see them as explanations. Your goal could be just pure prediction or visualization.
Thank you, JP. Naftali, go for it. Good to see
Hi.
you.
Yeah, thanks so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and it's good to see you.
Yes.
So yeah, this is going to be in some ways following up on the previous questions, because really at the core of it is whether these types of models are competing, but maybe to come at it from a different angle. So of course, I'm definitely on board with interpreting these models causally, or at least thinking about the underlying causal assumptions. But I'm wondering how much one should really accept this idea that you find throughout the psychometrics literature, that when you're giving a latent variable model, that really the latent variable needs to be something like in the brain, or something, some fundamental neural substrate, or there's sort of a background assumption that's not just you have a latent variable, but a latent variable with a particular type of interpretation. And of course, this makes sense in light of the history and intelligence testing, and it's supposed to be this really stable factor. But at least once you move away from that and are just kind of trying to do a general exploration, you have systems, do you use a latent variable model, do you use a network model, it's really a lot less clear to me that you couldn't have scenarios where you could say model the same system in two ways. So to make it a bit more concrete, so imagine a network model like one of them that you gave, where, as Aidan pointed out, there's usually an implied timescale for, and usually a fairly short timescale about these different symptoms influencing one another. And so you could have this really dense network where everything kind of influences everything, at least a little bit in the short term. And now imagine you're thinking about intervening, but by interventions, you specifically mean that you're sort of holding the variables fixed sort of day after day. So I'm giving someone a drug every day indefinitely, or I'm doing something to make them sleep better or have a better mood. And it seems at least plausible to me that when you talk about the interventions, some interventions will have long-term downstream effects and some won't. And you could end up with something like a latent variable model, where even though everything in the short term is influencing everything else, there are network variables that are more important for regulating the system, such that if you were to hold them fixed, if you were to hold them fixed, they would have downstream consequences, while other things that would actually not serve. So in some ways, this is really just pushing on the same thing that's already been raised. Are these different types of representations? But I guess it's a slightly different story about how they might actually, at least potentially, be just two different ways of describing the same system at different timescales.
Yes, this is very interesting, but I have I'm not sure if I understand it completely. So is your point that there could be something in a network, and as soon as it's sort of a stable cause of things in a network, at some point it will basically function as a latent variable, or is that not what you mean?
Well, so one thought is that actually the variables in the models are different variables if you're going to be, so basically, and of course it's a rough idea, but that when you're describing a network model and when you're giving a latent variable model, you're actually describing the same system at different scales. So, so there's extra assumptions going into how you're thinking about the variables, that, when you're giving a latent variable model, you're sort of limiting yourself to thinking about, some relatively stable variable and its long-term consequences. And exactly what to say is going on representationally is an interesting question, but the thought is somehow you're abstracting away from or aggregating out some shorter term behaviors.
So are you saying that maybe a different time scale could allow for a different model? So basically in the one time scale, you might use a latent variable model, and on a different, right? Yeah, that could make sense. And so they're not then competing, but they are maybe competing for a specific set of correlations that you're explaining, right? Because I guess if you're going to different time scales, you also get different correlations.
Yeah, so it would be different correlations. So
they're not completely competing, but maybe for explaining a certain correlation or covariance matrix at hand, they would not. They can both explain the same system over time, but a certain covariance matrix would still either be the one or the other, right?
Yeah, so it's yeah, for a particular data set, it's not always going to be, if you want to model these variables in this correlation matrix, that you can always do one or the other. It would be something like you have the same system that can be modeled with different sets of variables. Yeah. And
that sounds reasonable. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So I don't want to compete them, I think, as a sort of complete general explanation, like either it's a latent variable or, but I guess the thing you're trying to explain, so maybe a certain data set with certain correlations, there it helps to pit alternative explanations against each other, but not that if you then, for example, choose, this covariance matrix with this time scale is best represented by a network model, that means that there's not maybe still a latent variable model that isn't useful or true explanation on another level. That's interesting. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Naftali. Good to see you again. Kevin, go for it.
Excellent. Thanks. This is a cool talk. I don't know anything about this, so this is a sort of naive question. I was wondering if the following was like a adequate way to see like the distinction between the stats interpretation and the causal interpretation, like fix one of these models, like a latent variable or whatever, and like when I'm using the stats interpretation versus when I'm using the causal interpretation. You said something like the stats interpretation, the stats model is false when the assumptions it makes about the probability distribution for the data are false, and the causal interpretation is false if that's false or if it's got the causal structure wrong. And I guess what I was wondering at first was, well, which probability distribution are we talking about? Are we talking about just like the actual frequency distribution of the data? Or are we talking about like some objective, propensity or whatever, basically? Do we interpret that probability distribution causally or frequentist? Like I was thinking, I guess I'll finish the thought in a note. I was thinking we shouldn't interpret it frequentist like, because frequentism sucks and we're going to be in trouble then. maybe I'm wrong. But then so I was thinking, well, if it's a causal interpretation of the probability distribution, then we should interpret the stats as basically like a fully general causal model. It's like I'm not going to make any assumptions about how this probability distribution comes about, but just that, here's what it's an equivalence class basically of causal models that would give rise to the same distribution. So like that's how I was conceiving of it. Now your reaction suggests that I was wrong.
No, I think I missed the second part that you were arguing. Can you repeat the last part that you were saying?
I guess I was thinking the probability distribution we're talking about when we're talking about whether the stats model is right is not a frequentist one, because frequentism sucks. I mean, maybe that's wrong, but assuming that. And so what is it? Well, it's probably something like a objective propensity probability distributions. Like if you were to ask all the people about their personality, then here's the sort of answers you would get or whatever. And that looks like a sort of causal thing. It looks like a sort of at least an objective probability that's out there in people's dispositions or something like that. And so then I was thinking, well, so it does seem like the stats model is in some sense causal. It's constraining hypotheses about an objective probability distribution, which is maybe a causal probability distribution. But it's sort of causal in that sense, but it's a much more general. It's just sort of says, I don't know why this is the probability distribution, but here it is.
Okay, so first maybe I should say that what I actually meant are the distributions of the variables in the data, but they have a distribution in a population. And we take a sample from that population. But what I meant was a sort of multivariate distribution of these variables that you have in your data set. So you have your data set, but it's a sample from the distributions that sort of hold in the population. That's what I meant. But I'm not sure if then that you still have another question, because now it's not really about Bayesian or frequentist probabilities anymore.
I guess I was thinking that was a frequentist interpretation, and for that's the reason I was so like, suppose in fact everyone has the following disposition, like 90% of the time you ask them whether they're happy, they say no. That's objectively their disposition, but we just go poll the whole population, and it turns out that 50% of people say yes, I am happy, like fluke. It's whatever, a standard objectivist objection to frequentism. Then so would we say, yeah, so the stats model, which had the 90% disposition to say no, is wrong, because in fact the actual realization of the population is basically people deviated from their dispositions or whatever. Maybe I'm just
okay. So basically these models make assumptions about these distributions in the population. And so basically the way I see it is sort of like there are true correlations in a population. That's the population correlations. And we sample people from that population, and that's why we use statistical models. And in that sense, indeed, it's just sampling a random chance experiment, so it doesn't have to be Bayesian. But so basically, what is as purely statistical models, it's just a sort of description of these multivariate distributions in the population. And so as long as the model sort of for example, local independence means if we condition on the latent variable, then all the others become independent. Then in the data, we're not going to really see that because it's a sample and we have error, etc. But in the population, it would mean that these variables are independent of each other, are correlated zero.
I have one more follow-up. Should I?
What?
I think we're probably going to leave it there, Kevin. Thanks for joining us. Alex, go for it.
Hello, thanks for a really nice talk. I've used both of these tools, but just not in the manner in which you've kind of presented them as. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what you're keeping in mind as you're building this network to compare to the latent variable model. Like, are you assigning an edge between every single node, for example? Because that network quickly becomes far more complicated than the latent variable model, especially if you're using some confirmatory model in which you're like saying we're loading these 5 variables onto this latent variable. Can you just talk a little bit about how you're building the network and what you're thinking about as you're building it so that you can make meaningful comparisons?
Yes. Again, I'm not going to speak for everyone that uses these models because, I have my causal interpretation and people disagree with that. But so I would say, if you believe that these symptoms sort of influence each other directly, then one thing that sort of brings us close to that is the conditional independencies, because something that's causally related will be conditionally dependent. I'm immediately aware that not every conditional dependency actually has to reflect a direct causal relation. Maybe you have ignored common causes, etc. But that's the sort of, if we believe that there are direct causal relations, then it would be interesting to, rather than using a latent variable model, to sort of get an insight in these ones. So what we're going to do is estimate conditional independencies. And so you condition on the other variables, and what typically happens, but that's more the implementation part, is that it uses some sort of regularization to push down certain things that are close to zero to actually zero, so that you don't. So, for example, if you use partial correlations as a way at getting at conditional independencies, then in your sample, probably all partial correlations will be somewhat different from zero, but we don't want all the edges in, indeed. So it pushes down much of the edges that are very close to zero. And then hopefully you get a sort of sparse interpretable network. But of course, I then immediately have to say, well, with my causal interpretation, I know that some of these edges may be false, so we need more information to really get at the right structure. But that's sort of roughly the way they get these network models. And also, I think you suggested that in a way, network models are therefore more complex than, for example, confirmatory factor model. And I think that's true. I mean, it depends a bit on how you estimate it, but now typically they're exploratively estimated. And so you just search indeed for conditional independencies and push things to zero that are close to zero. And in that way, it's of course very flexible, because for any new data set, it would again do this thing. But you could make it more confirmatory, like a confirmatory factor model, if you, for example, say, oh, I have a theory to expect that certain things are exactly zero. Or maybe I have used a data set, and from that I know that these are zero, and I'm now confirmatively going to test it in a new data set. And then rather than pushing down things that are close to zero, you're just gonna constrain them to zero. And then whether it's more complex or not, and a factor model just sort of depends on how many of these edges you constrain to a certain thing. So if you constrain a lot, it can be a sort of simple model, but if you leave a lot open to be estimated, then it's a very complex model.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Paul, do you want to follow up, or we have a little bit of time?
Well, one thing this is not necessarily directly to a question I had, but I was thinking what Kevin was asking when you were talking about the statistical assumptions. I think the easiest way to sort of explain that is that they're assumptions on the parameters themselves, right, in the population. So frequentist or Bayesian, it doesn't matter. The assumptions are on the parameters, and that's what statistical models carry. But then network models carry that as well, right? So then the causal piece, I guess, is where the distinction. But that was just the thought I was having. I wanted to ask though about the status of components, like principal components and stuff, from a causal interpretation. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So first, about parameters, you're right. That's true. I just meant that the distributions, this multivariate distribution, is then described by parameters. So, for example, a mean and a variance, etc. So, yeah, you can use parameters to describe this multivariate distribution, basically. Yeah, so that's a very interesting thing, because principal component analysis is actually one of these kind of models that is quite similar to factor modeling, except that it doesn't make these an assumption, for example, like local independence. And so in PCA is more the dimension is a sort of linear transformation of the observed variables, and it's not, therefore it doesn't include assumptions that follow from the common cause perspective. So I really see that as a different, and so therefore I would also, yeah, if you don't see these models, the latent variable model causally, and you don't really have a rationale for taking an assumption as local independence anymore, then it might make more sense to do a PCA, because that doesn't make that assumption. And in fact, it doesn't only summarize whatever is shared between the observed variables, but also takes into account the unique parts of these variables. So it now just gives the best representation of all the variants in the observed variables, rather than only whatever is shared. And I think the only whatever is shared, just for me, follows very naturally from this common cause perspective. And if you don't have the common cause perspective, you could just as well just try to summarize as much variance as possible.
So what do you think the causal status of principal components would be in an interpretive way? Is, you know, aside from how they're formulated, the idea that these observations then lead to something that is kind of latent, but not really, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, do you see it as having a good causal interpretation for people to play around with when deciding on a psychometric model?
Well, if you give it a causal interpretation, I would turn the arrows around. So it's basically a formative model in the sense that the dimension you're making is a transformation of these observed variables. And it's just one where it's more a composite than an actual common effect of these things, because there's not other things going in there anymore. It's just basically completely composed out of those observed variables. But I would turn the arrows around, yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I was going to say one more thing. I think the causal assumptions like begin with our development. Like if you're developing a scale, you begin by saying, here's the construct of interest and here's the behaviors I'd observe. So it's like your causal assumptions begin before you even start developing the model itself. And like that I think is an important consideration. So that's all.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you all for coming for this really lively and interesting discussion. Thank you, Riet, for your lecture and for the Q&A as well. And we hope to see you on Friday at 3:30 for the ALS lecture, and next week for the other lunchtime talks. Have a good week. Bye.